Hello and welcome to New Books Network. I'm Pierre. Museums and art institutions have come under a great deal of pressure of late. Not only are they experiencing waning state support and forced entrepreneurialism, they are also receiving increased criticism from the inside. Artists and art workers have taken to calling out the failings of the institution, staging protests and boycotts. Can the museum serve the public if, as we are told, it continues to abuse its staff? Can the art institution change the world if it is unable to put its own house in order? My guest today proposes that these developments can be linked directly to the canon of institutional critique. In After Institutions, Karen Archey expands the definition of institutional critique to develop a broader understanding of contemporary art's sociopolitical entanglements, looking beyond what cultural institutions were to what they are and what they might become. After Institutions began as a curatorial research project for an exhibition planned for the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, where Karen is a curator. I'm very happy that she joins me now. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Karen, I'm really excited to talk to you. Your book, from its title, proposes that we're at a moment where we have to think about the future of institutions to the extent that we're talking about the future of institutions after institutions. But before we get to any of this, how is it that you came to write this particular essay?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that my interest in institutional critique, has a very long history. I wrote my
Mm.
thesis in undergrad actually on Rothers and Documenta 12, which was quite panned
Hmm.
in the press for being a very kind of heavy curatorial gesture. And ever since then, I'd thought a lot about how institutions support artistic practices and how they can also sometimes overtake artistic practices, and also the relationship of these two with the public and also public responsibility.
Hmm.
And over the course of the last 7, 8 years or so, I've been writing a lot of texts about health and
Hmm.
healthcare. And that was inspired, I guess, through some health problems that I'd had myself, and was thinking through what it means to be able to work in the context of the art world, which really necessitates a very high output, especially from writers, to be able to make a living, and also from artists. And I kind of felt like that, in terms of a set of ethics, didn't jive with how the art world perceives
Hmm.
itself.
Hmm.
And all of these interests kind of came together during a dinner that I write about in the book, with Joseph Grigley, Luke Willis Thompson, and also previous conversations with the artist Carolyn Lazard. And they were all speaking about their own struggles with health or care, or being able to just work productively in the art world. And then also their interest in institutional critique, and how all of them find a lot of inspiration in that canon. And I began to think about, okay, but what does it mean actually to work in the vein of institutional critique today? Because it doesn't feel like socially a very relevant, canon anymore, because it has a very specific aesthetic to it. And so I began researching and, thinking back to my own interest in institutional critique, pitched this exhibition After Institutions. And then, this was all during very turbulent changes at the Stedelijk, in which, our director resigned, and then we had a intermittent directorship, and then a new director, and then COVID, and it just didn't survive all of those changes.
Hmm.
And Aaron Bogart from Floating Opera Press at some point asked me if I wanted to turn an idea into a book, and I said yes.
All right. Well, that sounds nice and simple, but I think it's pertinent to remember as we go further that this is a book about a project that didn't take place, and I think that might cast a shadow over the entire idea of institutional critique as we as we go and historicize it. But I want to start with maybe a slightly disarming but very basic question: what is an institution in the context of institutional critique? How do we think about art institutions now, in the way that gives them the kind of relevance that makes them important outside of the art world?
I think I'll answer that in two different ways. One is that there's a kind of literal definition of the word institution, and that can be, a state funded organization that is meant to support the public, in a very, very broad sense. And then there's also the kind of term institution, which would mean the thing that has such an incredible presence in society that it is an institution. Like a person
Hmm.
can be an institution, a podcast can be an institution. So kind of more almost metaphorical usage of that term, which I think is really important. And I've had a lot of questions in response to the book in terms of what an institution can be, how
Hmm.
small it can be. Can you create an institution yourself? And then, secondly, the object of inquiry for the book went from being the art institution, which is one of the objects of inquiry within institutional critique, to institutions in a broader sense. So, including a more broad definition of state institutions and
Hmm.
thinking about their relationship with the economy and how they're functioning right now across generally the West.
So I think one of the things that comes out of this is that an institution is fundamentally an apparatus, a technology for reproducing certain values, certain social values. And I think that's a central question that gives rise to a practice of institutional critique, which is what you try to canonize and try to explore in the book. So maybe for those listeners who haven't come across the canon of institutional critique, we might start with outlining the historical context and maybe start in the 1960s.
Yeah, this is really difficult to sum up in a few sentences just because the practices during this time were very, very heterogeneous and there was not a kind of common understanding or shared goal
Mm.
between the artists that were working at the time. And it was only in the 90s that the term was actually coined. So this is kind of a retroactive framework
Hmm.
that you can kind of impose upon these artists. But what I think is a really good example of institutional critique is Lawrence Weiner's removal pieces.
I'll put a link to an image of this work in the show notes for listeners.
Within this piece, he's really simply removing a square of a rug from a gallery space and then putting it on the wall. And what the artists of this period were thinking through is how can we kind of not add any sort of visual representation into the gallery because it is incredibly commodifiable, and how can you push against the commodification of the art object and uh, basically create a relationship with the architecture of the space, but then not necessarily create something that can be placed within the realm of visual representation. So Lawrence Weiner's piece is a prototypical example of this because he's taking something from the gallery space that already exists and then just placing it on in a different part of the gallery. So he's taking the rug from the floor and putting it on the wall. In that, he's calling attention to how artworks work in the space as well, the kind of idea that it has a relationship to its container, to the building, to also pointing toward even more to the outside world and the outside forces that would give shape to, um, you know, how the gallery functions financially, economically, socially. So it's a very first, very formal attempt to reach outside of that. So this is, coming from this offshoot of conceptual art in the late 60s.
So I think that relationship actually between what has now been canonized as the prototypes, as the first works of institutional critique and conceptual art is quite important. So as you highlighted, one of the characteristics that we note here is the resistance to commodification of the art object, which I think to anyone who comes from outside of art is already slightly counterintuitive. How do these two sets of ideas come together?
Yeah. So in the book, I kind of trace this trajectory of artists thinking through how you pare down the art object to an idea. How do you take away the object status of the work to a realm of pure visual ideas? And this is also where the trajectory went toward with institutional critique. And, within Buclow's essay, The Aesthetics of Administration, he's thinking very much between how textual this kind of first generation was, with Kossuth and Bachner, thinking through how ideas are expressed through, a visual apparatus, a textual apparatus, and other forms of representation, which is really the kind of core project of conceptual art. And then the difference with institutional critique would be that it is more thinking through also the space within which it is installed. Um,
Mm.
so I would say that that's a quite core difference, and then very much influenced by this idea of paring down an art object or an artistic work down to its very core of an idea. And this is, of course, very different from, works that, were based in painting or minimalism or, works that were much more object based. In the book, I write about this trajectory from Duchamp that's, begins to inspire this as early as from the 1910s, thinking through artwork is not necessarily something that could be appreciated by a connoisseur, but would
Mhm.
have a different kind of relationship to quality.
And what's happening within the institution at that time? Because I think it's quite often easy to get carried away with the artist's demands on the viewer and on the surroundings and therefore the institution, but actually not understand what's happening to the museum, to the gallery themselves. So in the 1960s, capitalism is rampant. I think we've forgotten the long shadow of the Second World War by then. And I guess in the US context, at least, we could expect that institutions are getting very close to the market if they've ever got themselves removed from it. So maybe I can ask you to talk us through a little bit some of those developments.
Well, I would say that in the 1960s, the institution or the museum is seen as having an almost ultimate power in being able to create the careers and markets for artists. And they're, they were seen as kind of a very, maybe still are, seen as a very one directional force in the sense that museums don't really take a lot of feedback. And then the definition of the institution that a lot of these artists are using within the first wave of institutional critique is thinking about the physical space of the institution, the brick and mortar museum, and somewhat metaphorically, its inner workings and outer workings in relationship to broader society.
Hmm. Okay, well, let's speed through the next wave of, of institutional critique, which is when the term actually comes in. You cite the artist Greg Horowitz, who I'm going to paraphrase here, who describes his attitude to the first wave of institutional critique with the phrase, "I have no more questions to ask of gallery walls," which signals the change in the interest of artists practicing forms of institutional critique from the actual space, from the actual environment of the gallery, to maybe the museum's slightly more socially external function. And I guess the most famous exponent of institutional critique that I think probably even as the person who coins the term is the artist Andrea Fraser. So we're thinking about the 90s and the early 2000s, and again, a generation of artists who is also centered around New York. How is that division between the first and the second wave useful? What changes?
A lot changes in those in that period, and I think that that quote by Greg Bordowitz is really fantastic because it showcases the kind of radical attitude that a lot of the artists from the second wave felt. And of course, this is happening in the late 80s and early 90s during the height of the AIDS crisis.
Hmm.
So, Greg Bordowitz and other practitioners like Zoe Leonard are part of Diva TV, which is an offshoot group of ACT UP. And what I find interesting about that is that they have parallel practices. Greg and Zoe were activists, and then also, James Meyer writes this about this and what happened to the institutional critique. But the parallel practices that this group had were really important. Mark Dion was also a professor. Andrea Fraser is currently a professor as well.
Hmm.
But the main focus of this group was to look back through the genealogy of the institution to understand where it was at that period historically. So this group also had a very important, they were socially connected, and they had a very important mentor, Craig Owens, and also a lot of friends who were afflicted by AIDS. And their most crucial question, I think, in their work was to think through how an institution such as the healthcare system in the West could fail them so profoundly, and what kind of answer they could have within it with their work. And to do that, they were looking back to a more broad definition of the institution and its genesis.
Well, I think that's the point where things really start getting interesting, and I slightly suspect when you start getting into real trouble. I mean, reading your book and also knowing some of this history, I repeatedly in the margin kept on writing, why is the museum a good place to try to deal with healthcare? And healthcare is a recurring theme in at least a selection of works that you pick up on, but it would be wrong to deny that the AIDS crisis didn't feature in the New York art scene to a great extent. What is the logic by which the museum is the right place in which to discuss the failure of the welfare state? This is something that's happening for the first time in this kind of network post Gutenberg galaxy world in which the experience of a health crisis is global. Why does the museum become a site for thinking about it?
I mean, I think it is one site, right? So if you look at the practices of Bordowitz and Leonard again, those are people who were activists at the same time as they were artists. And I think that for me, I actually learn the most, I think, about life through aesthetic experience. And I'm able to reflect the most about my position, my life, the world at large through the works of artists who kind of push me to think through these things. And, I remember the first work that I saw, that moved me to think through the abortion debate. It was a Dwayne Hanson
Hmm.
work that I saw on vacation in Florida, I think in 1994. So I was probably about 9 years old. And it was a work or life size replica of a baby that had been thrown into a trash can. And it was about the restriction of abortion rights. Um, so it's a deeply pro choice work. And it got my brain thinking, like, why would this baby be in a trash can? Who's doing that? And why? And what are the conditions that produce this? And as a 9-year-old, that was an extremely formative experience for
Hmm.
me. So I think for me, it's that I deeply believe in the transformative ability of an aesthetic experience. I think that aesthetic experience is also something maybe that we need to define, especially in terms of
Yeah.
institutional critique, because institutional critique is known as being a lot of reading. And
Mm,
Andrea, I spoke about this with Andrea Fraser, what aesthetic experience necessarily entails. And I think, especially because when I was preparing this exhibition, someone on the curatorial team or management said, yeah, but it's an exhibition of institutional critique. We don't want to be reading all day.
mm,
And Andrea made the point that a cognitive experience is also an aesthetic experience. So I think that that's an interesting kind of addition to this discussion, that certain works that are based on reading can also be extremely transformative as
mm.
well, and in the context of a large public driven institution.
I think we've already got to what is, at least for me, a key point in defining the role of the institution for the 21st century and thinking about where things might have gone wrong and how they might be rescued. So you highlight in the book Andrea Fraser's slight unease with the first wave of institutional critique, which, through its proximity to conceptual art, has certain anti aesthetic qualities. I mean, that's to a certain extent an oversimplification. But I think Andrea Fraser might have had a point in as much as she actually has predicted a little bit of the aftermath of institutional critique. So, in as much as we have now completely embraced the expectation that the institution, the museum, the contemporary art gallery, is now completely imbued and charged with a very expansive social mission. So, in as much I completely appreciate the discussion in which various forms of cognition can be seen as aesthetic and are completely therefore at home within an art institution, there are aspects of just sheer forward kind of copy and paste representation that I think a lot of institutions are completely guilty of. And I wonder if Andrea Fraser wouldn't have already in the 90s asked quite sharp questions.
It's interesting. So what would you say that those processes are?
I mean, at the fundamental level, I asked what it is that an artist brings to anyone but themselves by being inserted into processes that they don't belong to. So, what is the utility of an art institution paying, not very well, but paying something above minimum wage for an artist to go and spend, say, 6 months popping in and out of community groups in a suburb, working with either people who have health problems or are disadvantaged economically, and so on and so on. I think what we have seen over the last 20 years is a confusion of institutional critique with what we call social practice.
Yeah,
So the very remit of what it is that a museum is for has completely been turned upside down to the cost of any aesthetic mission.
I totally agree, actually. I don't really touch social practice in this book, but I don't consider social practice really part of institutional critique or any kind of contemporary definition of institutional critique. And Andrea Fraser has really interesting thoughts on social practice, but she doesn't use those specific words. I think that her point is that institutional critique is site specific within the institution, and it actually is located in and around the field of art activity of artists. So
Mhm.
that means that social practice, which is happening, outside the primary field of activity for institutions and artists, is not really applicable within the sphere of institutional critique. And what I find interesting about her thoughts, and I tried to drive home throughout the book, is that the practice of creating exhibitions, the practice of collecting work, working with artists and curators, that is a material practice. It does
Mhm.
have actually very deep effects. And, I write the whole introduction about a kind of setting up the economic framework for where we are right now and, how we're functioning under neoliberalism. My point is that the way in which we experience kind of financial realities, social realities, is the same way that someone would outside, like let's say the sick patient being visited by an artist. So what I'm interested in actually is how the artist is being paid, not necessarily that they're going to see the sick patient. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm afraid this is the point at which I take I'm in great disagreement with you over how useful for either the art world or the world at large persisting with that question is. But maybe we'll get to that in a moment. I'll leave you on tenterhooks now because I want to make sure that halfway through in our conversation you deliver your proposal for where it is. Because even though this book is essentially an essay for an exhibition that didn't happen, and it does a fantastic job of kind of historicizing where we've got to, you do a couple of things. One is you begin the process of creating a canon for the third wave of institutional critique, but you also make a proposal for thinking about institutional critique in conceptual terms, which you do by pairing the perspectives from Andrea Fraser and also from Mignon Kwon, where you bring essentially the idea that you just mentioned of a critically reflective side from Fraser with the idea of a discursive side from Kwon.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different things happening. So, um, thinking through how artists are paid and thinking through, these kind of material realities within artistic production and museum work, I actually experience this on a day to day basis. And I see a huge need for it, especially
Mm,
in the United States, the UK, because when you start thinking about the ethics of your own labor and how you relate to others in terms of, you know, basic ethical practices in terms of labor, you realize the interconnectedness of your work with that of the world around you. So I actually think it's a very kind of important starting point for thinking through the interconnectedness of artistic practice and museum practice, you know, outside of itself. And then in terms of thinking through the kind of theory of the discursive site, basically throughout the book, I'm kind of coming to terms with the various definitions of institutional critique and thinking, okay, is this actually something that is relevant today? And the core question that I had is the theory of the anti-aesthetic strategy still relevant? And essentially, Fraser, you know, thinks that the anti-aesthetic strategy is probably the most important aspect of institutional critique. And I'll back up and explain what the
Mm-hmm.
anti-aesthetic strategy is. This is something that originated in conceptual art and the first wave of institutional critique, um, to basically pare away visual representation again, as I mentioned before, so that the art object, you know, function more in terms of in terms of the realm of ideas. And this is also something that was continued supposedly through the second wave through documentary practices. But I, in the book, you know, cast some doubt on what exactly that means, because I don't think necessarily that um, the second wave, you know, artists, you know, Fraser herself was making video material. You know,
Mm-hmm.
these are not super easily commodifiable practices, you know, in terms of them being video or performance, um, but they are commodifiable nonetheless, and they all have enjoyed great careers, um, and received awards and funding and etc. through these practices. So to me, I wanted to call into question, to what extent is this a valid criteria for institutional critique, especially when I have seen so many artists coming from backgrounds that don't include this kind of Whitney ISP,
Yeah.
Whitney Independent Studio Program upbringing. And I do come from that training. Like I studied under Mark Dion, Greg Bordowitz.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I very much belong to this kind of tradition of conceptual art. So it's ingrained in me. But I see a lot of artists working with a more expanded definition of institutional critique that is actually fundamentally object based.
Mm.
So this is also something I write about for the New Museum Triennial. What does it mean to not employ an anti-aesthetic strategy, but then still practice institutional critique? Is it called institutional critique, or is it something different? I would give an example here of a work that I think is relevant. I forget the name of the artist, but she was in the New Museum Triennial, and she was making drawings, very pared down drawings of the commuting route for all of the employees at the new museum.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell by how long and circuitous the um, commute was. You know, it's basically a map with like a
Mm-hmm.
line. And the longer the line, the longer the commute, the
Yeah.
lower the status of the employee in the institution. So these are works on paper, you know, kind of beautiful in their minimalism, but they certainly, it's certainly not a documentary or performance. You know, it's a very commodifiable work, and I think it goes to the heart of thinking through issues of equality within the institution, and to fundamentally not be able to even think through whether or not this is institutional critique, for me felt like, okay, maybe we need to think about updating this criteria. So again, this is where the idea of discursive sites came in through Miwan Kwan, and thinking through how important it is to locate a site in its discursivity, or like a certain
Mm-hmm.
issue, rather than necessarily, let's say, the architectural environment that the work exists in. So there were a few updates that I wanted to make to this definition. And interestingly, I had a long interview with Andrea in which she really does think that the anti-aesthetic strategy is very, very important. And I think that she does have a point to some extent, but her point is that when you give into easily participating in the art market, you also accept working under the conditions of capitalism and you're supporting the conditions of capitalism. She was very that whole group was very disappointed. And for example, Barbara Kruger, other artists that might seem critical, working with big galleries that also represent
Mm.
artists like David Sally. And I think it's the holistic vision of thinking through how do you work or try to envision a life outside of capitalism that they were really interested in. And my point is that I can't, and I use this Mark Fisher quote, it's easier to envision the end of the world than it is to envision the end of capitalism. So I see a lot of artists working through objects, working through a actually purely visual aesthetic experience.
Mm.
Well, that is also, of course, still cognitive. But I thought it was interesting to try to update that and work through her frameworks and see what I thought was still relevant today.
Hmm. But something troubles me a little bit in this proposal for a new definition and the return of the aesthetics. You mentioned the new museum, and the new museum is a site of a couple of labor disputes that become interesting in the context of trying to turn towards the management structures of the institution and its economic realities. So Hans Hacker, one of the fathers of institutional critique, had a retrospective in 2019. But what was interesting surrounding the exhibition is that was a moment when the new museum was trying to unionize itself, or
Yeah,
was at the very least the workers wanted to go on strike. And the thing to record here is that Hans Hacker refused to support the strike until after his own opening. So he didn't want to put the spanner in the works for fear of upsetting his opening party. Now, that's an indictment maybe of Hans Hacker himself, but it's also indicative of where it is that certain aspects of the more direct bits of institutional critique, when the institutional critique directly talks to its own institution from within it, take place. So we kind of in a place where it no longer is quite clear who acts in some of these movements. How should we account for that? Because we're slipping from what we used to think was the most important aspect of the institution, that was the artist. We now have this kind of catch-all term of art worker, and that's difficult to deal with from any kind of organizational theory point of view. But it's also very difficult for capital to deal with because we used to have the artist, God's representative on earth, and now we have to talk to the gallery invigilator about what the museum is about.
I think there's a lot of different facts that you could consider in this whole constellation. I mean, I would also make one correction in the sense that
Mm.
there was no strike.
Yeah.
So that, like, basically, I think that they had managed to unionize without striking, but it was just the conversation that was kind of brought to the fore by Dana Koppel, who was the union organizer
Mhm.
um, and the editor of New Museum. And then in the book, I talk through my own experience with Haka, which was, it's very surprising to me that he would, not support the strike, and very disappointing, naturally, but not in line with his previous work, and also
Mm.
how he treated me as a curator, which wasn't bad, but certainly not. It's not like he was an easy person to work with that, was like overly pleasing in terms of institutional schedules. And, there's certain artists that are very easy to work with because they
Mm.
understand how to operate smoothly within institutional structures. And I wouldn't say that he's one of them. So, um, yeah, that
And
was a,
and and you don't acknowledge that this could have been part of his institutional critique, becoming so difficult as to be ungovernable.
yeah, I
I'm,
mean,
I'm, I'm being mildly facetious here. I mean, I've worked with difficult artists myself many times. I know what it's like to an extent, but sometimes one wonders whether this is a method.
no, I think that's part of it. It's definitely
Mm.
part of it. I think that he specifically thinks of himself as having an autonomous position from the institution. And when I invited him for after institutions, he he also was like, I don't understand why you want to show this condensation cube. What does that have to do with institutional critique? And of course, it's
Mm.
widely considered to be one of the most
Yeah.
important proto institutional critique works that exist. But okay.
And he does know it, of course. Yeah.
And
Mm.
but there was also, we wanted to do an updated visitor poll with him, and he really was thinking through what it meant to update the visitor poll for the Dutch landscape, and
Mm.
specifically wanted to do weeks and weeks of research, reading Dutch newspapers, getting back into the Dutch context. Also, pointed toward a work that was in the collection of the Van Abbe Museum that hadn't been shown for a very long time, that would probably, yeah, that he was kind of concerned that would have some political implications of pulling that out, because it was about the relationship of um, Philips, a Dutch
Hmm.
company or corporation, with apartheid. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's, I didn't experience him to be, a kind of easy artist, and I think that that is definitely a part of his politics. And
Mm.
so hearing about this, I mean, I guess maybe there's a difference also in wanting your party, like like where does that.
Everybody wants a party. But I guess that's an important thing to remark on. Andrea Fraser, one of the things that she's most famous for is in an essay trying to define institutional critique just as it was fading out of focus in the mid 2000s. She highlighted the fact that we are always already implicated. It is impossible for an artist working within the institution to critique the institution without essentially being incentivized to spare themselves some of the critique. And maybe this is where the distinction between the artist, the person who supposedly gets all the glamour, even if, as you highlight in the book, they might not be getting paid all that much, or the conditions might not be favorable. In the end, the artist is rewarded to be complicit with the institution. And maybe that's a moment for me to ask the big question, the point at which I draw a different conclusion from our thinking about institutions. I would propose that art institutions, in part through through the expansion of the remit, I think that art institutions have been guilty of massive overreach to the extent that they have placed their tentacles in just about every aspect of social life and have claimed some kind of control, but not taken responsibility for what they do there. And because cultural institutions continue to be the site which reproduces social legitimacy, even if they become very weak at kind of propagating these ideas through aesthetic means, they still have an important role for a certain social class in reproducing social norms. My contention is that we've reached a point at which institutions are so deeply entrenched in replicating neoliberal norms that they actually reproduce the impossibility. They reaffirm the impossibility of getting out of those conditions. So, as with Mark Fisher, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the closing of a museum. And I'm wondering what happens at the end of the institution. What happens after institutions? That's essentially the thing that your book takes us towards. What alternatives to the institution you might see, or in fact, whether you see any of these problems that I've just highlighted are indeed, as I believe, almost terminal.
It's a very interesting set of questions. And I don't disagree with you. I think that my read is in definition of expanding the definition of institution is maybe slightly different, because
Hmm.
I don't think that artists should be going to do, certain kinds of work outside of their training, or outside of
Hmm.
their knowledge base or experience level. I very much agree with that, that's a kind of silly practice, to be perfectly honest. It's more that I'm trying to push the definition of institutional critique toward a more broad understanding not just limiting it to the art institution, but also thinking through how institutions are part of a kind of broader installation or constellation that help people live a healthy and fulfilling life, to be able to produce artwork, to be able to participate in society in a productive way. And so it's maybe a slight nuance there. And I would also point to the title again, after institutions,
Mm,
having a duality of meanings. So there's also the
mm,
wordplay on the fact that after could mean in the style of, and that's very intentional in the title, that it's not
yeah.
just thinking about a time after institutions, but also in the vein of institutions. And what does it mean to work within the frameworks that we have, and also potentially envision a different future for them. So we started this conversation with a private chat about what I'm doing in the summer months that didn't make it to the podcast, but
Mm,
um, and I'm talking about how much administration I'm doing to just kind of keep the collection up to date and
mm,
going at the Stedelijk. And I think that that's, one of my hurdles as an institutional curator for an art museum that collects. To be able to think beyond that for me is really difficult because I take the care of artwork so seriously. So I
mm,
do believe that there is a place for the care of art objects within art organizations that I very, very much believe in. I think for me, thinking through what I see, at the institutions I've worked at in terms of governance structures, boards, funding structures. I mean, it's just overwhelmingly badly produced. I mean, it's just, you know, people who are on boards have no idea what the day to day functioning of an institution should be. They don't understand what curators do sometimes, um, or how artists make work, or, um, the funding structures at most institutions produce bizarre effects like naming bathrooms and elevators after patrons. And, it's just, it, where we are right now is creating so many silly issues, ethical issues. It's just such a bizarre time right now for institutions that I do think it's very healthy to imagine a complete reinvestigation of what this could be. We're also seeing, for example, a lot of collective leadership in institutions and also in biennials.
mm.
Thinking, collectively is also something that I find really interesting in terms of a kind of shared leadership. Hito Steyerl wrote an essay for this book, edited
I've-
by, I'm just going to fact
I think
check
I know.
this.
It's a red cover
Yeah, the
institution.
red
Yeah,
cover
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, but so she wrote this essay about how we're not going to go, like, one of the side comments was that, okay, well, we're in a really sticky situation with the neoliberal institution and the supporting the gig economy, but we're not going to go back to some sort of Fordist lifestyle where we all can work in institutions and get paid from 9 to 5 and live happy and
Mm,
fulfilling lives. Like, history doesn't necessarily go backwards. So what is it going to look like? And I think that that's one of the goals of the book, is to open up that conversation of, like, what do we want from institutions? Do we still want them? Can we save them? Do we want to save them? And for me, because I think I work at an institution, I really do want to save them. And
mm.
this is why I wrote this book, to think through the material practices of how we work, and also how that relates to exhibition making, artistic practice,
Mm.
and envisioning a better future for institutions.
Okay, just as a way of comment, I actually really appreciate the fact that you have the discipline to, not too begrudgingly spend your summer doing collection administration. I mean, that is objectively one of the things that an institution is designed to do, since we invest, still some public money into the collection of all these objects that are supposed to represent our cultural collectivity. It is right that these processes are given due care. So we talked about the museum as a site as an apparatus for reproducing of social values. And I'm interested in your thinking about whose social values it is that the museum should reproduce or the institution should reproduce. And of course, this is a bit of a catch-22. It's a circular question because the definition of an institution to a certain effect is that it, the values themselves are the institution. But we've seen a bunch of interesting contestations of that. Your listeners might know about the recent wholesale takeover of the contemporary art scene in Poland, for instance, where institutions like the Ujazdowski Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw have had the directorship, the leadership changed forcibly by the government, and the entire contemporary art scene of the country is in great uproar that the state should dictate what the values of the institution are. And now, while I have some sympathy with that, I also have sympathy with the state's desire to control the institution it funded and it funds to reproduce its values. So that shows the kind of nuance and the at some point countercultural role of the museum, but also the need for the museum to posture this kind of counterculturality. So, to an extent that the institution is the museum is a neoliberal institution, it sort of still wants to be counter something. So, whose values does the museum reproduce?
I think it's interesting because I don't know if this was intentional, but I feel like you've given a little bit of a historical chronology of how institutions function. Because I would say in a pre-neoliberal moment,
Hmm.
institutions were much more an expression of the state. This is also
Yeah.
very much the work of Marcel Broodthaers, thinking about
Hmm.
how in Belgium art institutions and other institutions are very much expressions of state ideology, whether or not it's very clear or not. And this is, of course, the reason why he founded his museum in his apartment, the Musée d'Art Moderne Department of Eagles.
Hmm.
Um, a kind of buffooning, satirical institution that collected various state paraphernalia to point toward, the function of art is very much intertwined with the function of state expression. Um, but I think that as institutions have become more neoliberal, and by that I mean actually specifically privately funded,
Hmm.
um, of course, the representation of values change. Um, and then, I think about the Stedelijk, for example, where, I'm very much involved with the day to day functioning of the institution. And I think about, okay, how would that work in my day to day work? How do
Hmm.
I think about the values that I express in my exhibitions? And I think it's a very complicated question if you think about it practically, because it's difficult to identify the moment in which that expression of value happens. I would say that um, there's obviously a very felt need socially that has been communicated to museum directors that they need to be more inclusive, work on their equity initiatives, and that is certainly a value that is being expressed by institutions today. And the crux of the book that I've written is about how do we make sure that we balance that social need with actually acting um, through a set of values and ethics that are um, needed. Um, with that said, there are a lot of like holes you could poke in that argument. What are the values that are needed? What is at stake in terms of being socially progressive? For me, when I look at the collection of the Stedelijk, there are 6 to 8% women makers in the collection, which is just shocking. And I think that that's a value for me that goes without saying that we need to fix that. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking through in terms of values. But yeah, does that answer your question, or would you want to push
Yeah,
a bit
to
more on it?
Well, I mean, if I wanted to push you, I would probably go back to the example of the Polish institutional scene. So, in as much as the museum has become neoliberal, it has become also progressive and globalist, because, of course, neoliberalism is not just the kind of evil flavor of capitalism that promotes atomization. I mean, progressive values stem quite directly from capital's efficiency in exploiting us one by one, as opposed to in collectives. So the backlash against the, say, non-progressive or non-neoliberal Polish government at the moment is a very interesting moment where the institution kind of pushes back, and it doesn't really know where to go, because what may be happening if we have this kind of Trumpian populist movement in the government, that's a rejection of those neoliberal values. So I think this is the problem for the institution in trying to explain what its values are. To a certain extent, the thing that you describe in redressing the gender balance in the collection, which is, I couldn't think of a reason to argue with. Like, of course, this is something that should be happening. But from that perspective, we also have to be able to critique the institution from understanding those kind of values and then doing pointless things like posting black squares on Instagrams and doing performative change, because actually that is retrenching into the neoliberal, into the global. One of the examples you had in the book, and I'm not going to be able to remember the names now, but you mentioned a Chinese artist for whom one of the aims of the contemporary institutional critique that they were practicing was the creation of further international opportunities for Chinese artists. And to a certain extent, that's a kind of catch-22, because a world in which those opportunities exist is also the world that reproduces the kind of dead end of the neoliberal institution. It's more globalization. It's more universal values for the entire world, which
Yeah,
we can't critique the Enlightenment project's universalism and then replace it with globalization of our own and claim that they're somehow much different.
I think that institutions have such a wide sphere of activity that it's difficult to speak about this generally. It's at some point
Mm,
because there is everything going on within the institution, from posting these black squares to redressing the kind of awful balance of gender in the institution, and then what Liu Ding says in, that he simply wants more opportunities for Chinese artists. That also goes all the way back to education. He's thinking
mm,
through, okay, he can't speak English very successfully, like he understands English, but he sees that as an opportunity to be able to have a sense of collaboration with other artists, other
mhm,
curators, and that's what he wants. He wants to be able to just be educated and have more tools to work with. With that said, I think that there is a catch-22 in the book where if you don't burn institutions down, you're essentially asking people to be invited into exploitation to some extent,
mm,
because this is a fucked up place. Like, institutions are fucked up. Like, there's no way around it. Um, there's not always equitable treatment that is being, can be promised by institutions. So, what does it mean then to extend that collaboration to, for example, a Chinese artist who is otherwise working, solely in Beijing because he has a, limited amount of resources in terms of language and funding,
mm,
etc. But yeah, I think that the core premise of the book is that field of arts is too often seen as a representational activity and not seen as a material activity. And I've talked
mm,
about this a couple times in the interview. And I've really noticed that from my daily practice as a curator, that, for example, we would do an exhibition on sustainability, but then have 50 loans from around the world that we have to
mm.
create and ship in. Or we're doing an exhibition or an event on accessibility, but then none of the elevators work in the institution. So,
Yeah.
or we don't have captioning for the talk um, on accessibility, so that the deaf people in the audience can participate. So
Yeah,
it's these kinds of
I feel bad for laughing, but I mean,
well, it's,
these questions are so obvious. I think we must acknowledge that they are actually built into the logic of the institution.
you would be surprised how much
Mm,
people don't think about these things, and
mm,
also who feel entitled to not think about them. And this is
mm,
the very, definition of privilege that a lot of people are kind of operating under within institutions. And it's not, I think that this is a worldwide phenomenon,
mm.
unfortunately.
Maybe to round up, I could give you an opportunity to actually name some names and describe a couple of practices of what you propose is the what you propose the third wave of institutional critique is. So you mentioned Hitler, who I think is widely acknowledged as the world's foremost critic of institutions. But maybe you could talk about some examples of practices that you think form the core of institutional critique today.
What I was thinking about in terms of aesthetic experience that I haven't really wrote super a lot about in the book, and I haven't really spoken a lot about this, but the exhibition was also planned to be quite expansive in terms of its definition of institutional critique, because I was interested in the viewer experience being, almost like a story that's being told
Hmm.
throughout the exhibition. So one of the first works that you would see in the exhibition is this Mario Garcia Torres piece, Preliminary Sketches for the Past and the Future, quote unquote, Stalic Museum. And this
Hmm.
is a slide based piece that he made during the time that the Stedelijk was closed from 2005 to 2012. And in
Hmm.
it, you see people in what looks like a ruin in the building of the Stedelijk as it was being renovated, kind of jumping around. And I think that there's a term that he uses for the kind of performative element of his work, but it's like basically they're testing their bodies against the walls.
I'll put a link to an image online for listeners.
So I think that that work was meant to set the stage as, we're kind of existing in a ruin right now. It's a
Mm,
very metaphorical work. A lot of the works, and I write a little bit about metaphor in the book and Sontag as well. Um, but it's supposed to help the viewer, and also not just art professionals, but, I was thinking about my parents or my cousins. How would they how would they relate to this content? How would they be able
mm,
to understand it? And I also thought about my ethical responsibility making an exhibition that can be understood by a public that doesn't necessarily have the education about conceptual art that this canon is rooted upon. So this is also how I got into these conversations with Andrea about the anti-aesthetic strategy and how
mm,
important it is in cognitive experience being aesthetic experience. Um, but so those are some works that I was thinking of. Also, there's these Isa Genskin photographs from the Stedelijk collection that I was really interested in. They're titled or Ear,
mm,
and they're just these photographs, these very cropped photographs of ears that are meant to, she also has installed these ears outside of institutions to look as if they're life size institutional ears to call into question what is the role of the institution? Is it meant to be this kind of entity in society that listens and function as a membrane, like an ear between the public and society? So a lot of these works are metaphorical. There's also a work by Josh Klein that is not necessarily metaphorical, but it's explanatory in the sense that he has been making a lot of portraits of, you know, various people. For example, people who have been laid off from their work because of
mm.
automation. So, um, people who are kind of left behind society that are then 3D scanned, and he places them in plastic bags, for example. Um,
Eek.
yeah. So it gives a mood, right? Like there are a
Mm,
lot of moods in the kind of exhibition version of after institutions. And then, those are works that are very much, more object oriented in their practice. But then there are artists who actually went through the Whitney Independent Study Program, studied with people like Andrea Fraser and Greg Bordowitz and Mark Dion, such as Park MacArthur. And Park really
Mm.
does work through the anti-aesthetic strategy. I talked a little bit, I believe, in the book about her work Ramps, in which she brings together like maybe 15 to 20 ramps that have been made for her, to be able to enter into various arts organizations, because she's a wheelchair user, and she lays them on the floor in a kind of grid that would very much, because it's a floor piece, it very much calls into mind the legacy of minimalism.
Mm.
And what I find so special about that work is that when you're thinking about minimalism, I immediately think about how the body is meant to be seen as a kind of universal um,
Yeah.
standard. So you're always standing at one height, you're always standing upright. Um, and there's certain things that um, Park's work pokes holes into the logic of minimalism in a way that I find really, really strong. And also in that work, Ramps, there's a Wikipedia link just written on the wall to, I believe, Martha Russell, a disability rights activist.
Hmm.
So, Park is, I think, maybe in her late 30s, early 40s. And, she's very much someone that I would consider to be an institutional critique, a third wave institutional critique artist
Hmm.
working today, hands down, no question. She fits all the criteria.
Done. You've got control. You wrote the book, Karen. You get to decide.
But I think it's also interesting to think through who are the other artists that maybe don't so neatly fit all the boxes, and what does it mean? And, you asked also earlier, what does it mean when someone is enacting what feels like institutional critique from a non-artistic position?
Hmm.
And that to me is also an open question. Can I, as a curator, enact institutional critique? And what is institutional critique if it's known by any other name? Um, One thing that I noticed in my research, I spoke to various curators and museum directors, critics about institutional critique in the last 5 years. And there was a kind of generational difference toward
Mm.
opening or closing the canon. And a lot of the older people really felt strongly about institutional critique being a canon that happened at a certain moment, and that if there's a new canon, or a new kind of movement inspired by institutional critique, it should have a different name.
Mm.
And also that, like, but they're like, why would you want to be part of this? For me, I found that really interesting because there were artists that already laid the groundwork
Mm.
for what's happening right now, who asked really important questions, And I think that there's a lot of enrichment that can happen if you compare these practices in a chronology side by side.
I think what you propose is incredibly valuable, but I think in a slightly more depressing mode, the turn against institutional critique, the second wave, I think that signals the institutional's weakness and the art world's weakness. That's the point at which, having confronted the fact that we are all replicating the values, the values of neoliberalism in that instance, that we want to row out, oh no, no, we've come too close to understanding that actually what we're doing might be counterproductive or toothless. And the art world, just like any other institution, is required to reinvent itself in order to render itself legitimate.
Yeah, for some reason, Derek Jarman immediately came to mind, and how he was so not part of institutional critique during the
Mm,
second wave, and how geographically focused the second wave was in New York, and
yeah.
how he was kind of an independent person working during the AIDS crisis that was so incredibly enormously important, critiquing the Thatcher government and their policies, but then also worked through such an incredibly highly commodified style, in terms of
Hmm.
painting later in his life, when he wasn't able to make films anymore. He was always a painter, but the black paintings that he made later in life, as well as some word-based paintings where he's painting with his fingers or executing it through the bodies of other people, are incredible. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's so many questions to open about his practice and how he fits in, but I think that there are also incredibly important figures and historical lessons that we can learn from people like Jarman who were never canonized. So this is also a bit the project of institutional, uh, or after institutions in the book, is to think more expansively about the lessons that um, we needed to learn that haven't necessarily been written down in one place.
Well, let's keep doing it. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you so much. This was a nice conversation.
After Institutions by Karen Archey is published by Floating Opera Press. I'm Pierre, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thanks for listening, and join us next time.